Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, and welcome to this session, which is all about situating polygamy. My name is Blair Van Dyke. I teach courses here at the University in Philosophy and Religious Studies. And again, you are most welcome. And particular welcome to our presenters, Lindsay Hansen Park, Brady Williams, and Jennifer Huss Basquiat. Our presenters today will speak in succession, and then they will convene on the floor here of the stage, and the dialogue will begin. Conversations between each other, questions and answers from the audience, and so forth. And so it is my pleasure then to introduce our panelists, our speakers today. Jennifer Huss Basquiat is a professor in anthropology at the College of Southern Nevada. She earned her doctorate in cultural studies at Claremont Graduate University in 2001, where she conducted field work examining the intersection of Mormonism and Haitian voodoo. She has been conducting field work in Centennial Park since 2010. She recently served as a consultant for National Geographic's Polygamy USA. In addition to teaching, she is currently working on a book based on her fieldwork, Underground But in the Light, the plural community of Centennial Park. Lindsay Hansen Park is assistant director of the Sunstone Education Foundation and serves on the Sunstone Board of Directors. She is the founder of the Feminist Mormon Housewives podcast. Her work and voice have appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Prevail, and other national publications. She has also appeared on the Salt Lake Tribune's Trib Talk, addressing issues related to Mormonism in contemporary culture. Outside of Mormon studies, she serves on the board of directors for the Whitefield Educational Foundation and is actively engaged in women's rights, advocacy, and global activism. Finally, Brady Williams is a student in Peace and Justice Studies at Utah Valley University. His family was the subject of the Learning Channel's reality television program, My Five Wives, an American reality television series broadcast on the Learning Channel that began airing in 2013 and documents the life of the polygamist family. The family began the series living in an undisclosed city outside of Salt Lake City, Utah, due to fear of prosecution for polygamy. If you would please join me in welcoming our presenters today, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
I feel like I need a phone book up here. Short. All right, when the Saints left Nauvoo, beginning in February 4th, 1846, they had the intention of heading somewhere towards the Rocky Mountains, and where they ended up for the next 2 years was not exactly where they planned. Due to heavy rain and poor planning, these Mormons found themselves illegally squatting on Indian land. This Indian land happened to be protected by the Indian Intercourse Act of June that was instituted in June of 1834. The federal government called them Omaha lands, and the Mormons called them winter quarters and Council Bluffs. These laws were designed to protect traumatized indigenous groups that were recovering from forced removal from their ancestral lands. It was supposed to create an Indian barrier between white expansion and, the rest of the frontier. And whites were not permitted to go into this land without a passport. But of course, the Mormons show up there, and the government says, we need to know the length of your stay. The Mormons say, we're here to help the Indians. And they established their winter quarters. But this meant invading previously unspoiled Indian lands where whites were forbidden. So this brings them into immediate conflict with the Indian office. So even though Mormons felt at odds with the federal government, they used this divide to align themselves with Indians, but they soon began to wear out their welcome in Omaha lands, so much so that so many tribes complained to Council Bluffs Indian agent Thomas Miller, and he flatly told Brigham Young, the best thing you can do to help these Indians is to leave. as soon as you possibly can. You're destroying the timber, you're destroying the game, and these people are starving and in worse conditions than when they started. Mormons felt that this, again, was an example of them being persecuted and misunderstood by outside forces. The federal government was already skeptical of Mormons, and while the Mormons wouldn't publicly come out with the practice of polygamy until Orson Pratt's public campaign in 1852, the tension was growing, and rumors of this strange group and their strange practices were still swirling. When the Mormons found themselves on the literal boundaries of the frontier, the literal boundaries of the United States, the literal boundaries of public acceptance, they soldiered on. This is our Mormon story, right? These tensions only strove towards solidifying their identity as a socio-religious group, rather than forcing themselves to distance themselves from it. They were Mormons first and Americans second, with tenuous connections to the latter at best. It's interesting that one of the first defining mechanisms for Mormons, historically speaking, regarding their identity as a spiritual group, comes from external pressure and what we call the peculiar people, that's a hard word for me, peculiarities of the group. It's almost when told what to do from outsiders, Mormons feel revived, strengthened, and more firm in their purpose. It's ironic then that even those within the Mormon movement, or rather the Restorationist heritage, find themselves at odds with one another, trying to define for themselves and for others just exactly who everyone is and who everyone gets to be. As polygamy becomes more public, the polygamy narrative becomes another mechanism to strengthen the Mormon identity as a peculiar and persecuted people. We are the ones that have the true order of marriage. We are the ones that have the truth, and everyone else doesn't. Outsiders don't understand us. Mormons have the truth. Plural marriage is the higher order of God. Monogamy is of the devil, and it was even said that monogamy brought down the fall of Rome. The term Mormon or Mormonite was initially a derogatory term applied to the Latter-day Saints in the 1830s, but soon it didn't take long for the general early church to adopt the term themselves. The term became inextricably linked with polygamy, and for nearly a century, we see editorials, political cartoons, and exposés that were written about polygamous Mormons, linking the two terms together, polygamy and Mormon. This is why in the mid to late 19th century, some Latter-day Saint denominations who never practiced polygamy, who shunned the practice, distanced themselves from the term Mormon. So even though parts of the early church considered themselves Mormons, once polygamy came out and into the mix, groups like the Community of Christ or the RLDS Church said, we don't want to have anything to do with the term Mormon. That does not identify us. That's a polygamy term. It was plural marriage that defined Mormonism. It was plural marriage that ultimately sent them to the borderlands of the frontier, and then to the borderlands of Mexico, and soon to be Utah territory. It was polygamy that kept Mormons from statehood for decades, and that embroiled them in a large public debate where their highest order of marriage was linked with one of the twin relics of barbarism, including slavery. It's precisely this external pressure from Gentiles and outsiders like the federal government that propelled and calcified the Mormon faith. And the 20th century would bring new and interesting changes to the Mormon borders and identity. I get this need for identity, I really, really do. I felt it very deeply myself. I've even felt sort of those tingles of defense when someone compares my family to, say, that of Warren Jeffs. In casual conversation, no, we're nothing like them, we're nothing like them. In fact, even when I talk to regular LDS Mormons and I use the term Mormon fundamentalists, I get a lot of defense. One of the first things I hear will say, those people aren't Mormons. Those aren't Mormons. They're different. We don't practice polygamy anymore. We are different. They are a different group. They have nothing to do with us. Polygamy has been taken off the earth. For the sake of clarity and to give each group their sense of unique identity apart from their Mormonism, I'm going to use the terms FLDS group to describe the Fundamentalist Latter-day Saints, or the AUB group to refer to the Apostolic United Brethren, or the LDS group to describe the Latter-day Saints, or any of these other acronyms that we come up with. If the term LDS group makes you uncomfortable, perhaps it will reveal an inherent bias that you might have that needs to be taken out and examined. I use these terms deliberately and strategically because while the LDS group would like to be known as the church and the Mormons, in fact, the LDS Church went so far as to trademark the term the Mormon Church, the historical record disrupts the story and complicates it a little bit. And I know that's uncomfortable because I've even heard it at this conference today when we're talking about Mormonism, we say the church to refer to the Latter-day Saint Church. To understand the story completely, you need to understand the history of plural marriage itself and its relationship to the mainline LDS group, as well as its part in the overall Mormon movement. For 2 centuries, polygamy is what defined the boundaries in the Mormon movement. Because the early church never established a clear criteria for succession, polygamy became more of a litmus for the faith than some things, including the Book of Mormon in some cases. It's largely to blame for why the Brighamite church left the early church and headed west. Polygamy is largely responsible for shaping the mainline LDS group, both by its reaction to and a century of distancing itself from the practice of polygamy. This is why I don't consider the mainline LDS church the original church. No such church exists anymore. We have the early church, and then we have schismatic or extant groups. The LDS group is one of them. Restorationist scholars John Hamer and Steve Shields estimate in their forthcoming updated version of Divergent Paths of the Restoration that there are well over 400 extant groups within the Restorationist movement. 400. It's kind of hard to determine, but that's a pretty close number. It's important when talking about these groups and the various belief systems and practices that we all recognize that they all have a claim to the Mormon movement. I say this all the time to people. Why do you think there are so many breakoffs? Why do you think there are so many split-offs? And a common answer I get from my LDS friends are, well, Satan led them astray. And I would say, think again. Nobody wants to be the bad guy. Nobody wants to be the outlier. No one wants to be corrupted by Satan. Everybody in these groups have, for the most part, in my opinion, have legitimate claims to this history. They have legitimate stories of succession. The way that their keys are passed along are very similar in the same way that Brigham Young got the keys during the succession crisis, the 2-year period after Joseph Smith's death. There are parallels. There are certain Mormon parallels between all of these stories. And perhaps the similarities are what cause us LDS members sometimes to feel insecure with the public perceptions and maybe even a little territorial of Mormon identity. In 2008, the LDS groups started a public campaign to own the term Mormon. On June 24, 2008, Elder Lance B. Wickman, General Counsel of the LDS Church, sent out a letter to major newspapers, TV stations, and magazines. And I want to thank Ann Wild for digging up some of these primary documents for me with her very well-kept scrapbooks. The letter, which was a response to the FLDS raids in Texas and the international media coverage, stated that, quote, over the years, in a careful effort to distinguish itself, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has gone to significant lengths to protect its rights in the name of the church and related matters. Specifically, we have obtained registrations for the name, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Mormon, Book of Mormon, and related trademarks from the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office and corresponding agencies in a significant number of foreign countries. I just want you to let this sink in for just a minute. The LDS group tried to trademark the term Mormon, the term that defined the group by its polygamous practice, so that it could take the term Mormon from groups who were still living the polygamous practices that defined the term in the first place. Of course, this letter led to several responses from different Mormon fundamentalist groups. The Mormon fundamentalist advocacy group Principal Voices issued a response press release. They were speaking for independent Mormon fundamentalists, the AUB group, the Kingston group, the Work of Jesus Christ, which is Centennial Park, and several other groups, and they asked to be given the courtesy to self-identify with their own group. Here's a quote from that release. They said, quote, we strenuously object to any efforts to deprive us and others of the freedom to name and describe ourselves by terms of our own choosing. Fundamentalist Mormons have been referred to by that name since the 1930s, often by the LDS Church itself. We are proud of our Mormon heritage. Plural marriage is only one of the tenets of our religion, the gospel of Jesus Christ as restored through Joseph Smith. Mormon and religious scholar John Walsh, who served as an expert witness for the state of Texas during the FLDS raid case, said, quote, I don't know how you can't call them fundamentalist Mormons. A Mormon is someone who believes in the Book of Mormon, who has a belief that Joseph Smith was called of God in some way. And Mormon scholar Carmen Hardy said, quote, "From the fundamentalist point of view, they are the real Mormons because they continue to adhere to Smith's original teachings that polygamy brought exaltation to heaven." So the LDS groups comes out with a list of statements to distinguish us from, say, Warren Jeffs' group. Here are some of the lists. They say, quote, "The LDS group excommunicates members found practicing polygamy. Members of the LDS group wear regular modern clothes and have contemporary hairstyles." I say that's true if you're not in Tooele County like I was. "The LDS group encourages both secular and religious education. The LDS group does not practice or condone arranged marriages." And then, as if to issue a definitive statement, included, "One cannot be a polygamist and be a Mormon." One cannot be a polygamist and be a Mormon. As if nearly 200 years of shared history with leaders including Brigham Young, John Taylor, Lorenzo Snow, Wilford Woodruff, Joseph F. Smith, Heber J. Grant, and Joseph Smith Jr., all practicing polygamists, are suddenly redefined as what? I could spend the next 3 hours refreshing the memories on these histories that make that statement a distortion of the record, but I'd rather talk about how these groups and those within the Mormon movement are claiming the term Mormon in spite of one group's attempt to co-opt and control the name. Although the Intellectual Reserve, Inc., which is a holding company of the church's intellectual property, has tried multiple times to trademark this name, and they have in some forms. For example, they can trademark Mormon Tabernacle Choir and the Mormon Church. Courts have ruled that Mormon as a term is too general. Many know that I come from the LDS group, that I was baptized in the LDS group, and my parents and grandparents come from it, all the way back to the Brighamite group and into the early church. I feel like I have a fairly decent grasp on boundary maintenance within the LDS group. I often work with mainline Mormons who worried that the strict boundaries in the LDS group is going to leave them having someone else define their Mormonism for them, whether it be through church discipline, excommunication, social pressure. We already have labels in the LDS church like Jack Mormon, Molly Mormon, Liberal Mormon, Conservative Mormon. I tell those that are worried about having their Mormon identity taken away from them to first look back at the history and see how nearly 400 groups, with more than half still claiming the term Mormon, exist in the Mormon movement. And then I point to my fundamentalist friends who, for not quite a century yet, have been ostracized by their LDS cousins and yet don't seem to be deterred in claiming the name at all. In fact, it's as if the LDS group has suddenly become the outsiders of the Mormon faith, exerting external pressure on these fundamentalist groups. And when the LDS church tells them they aren't Mormon, they proudly say, "The truth is, we are Mormon. We're actually the real Mormons, and we're more Mormon than you because we're still, holding on to Mormon doctrine." So they don't even listen when, the LDS church tries to define their Mormonism. It actually makes them feel more Mormon. The LDS church claims the title mainstream largely in part of its large membership, but it is to be credited for abandoning polygamy. Once they did this, once they officially abandoned polygamy, and of course that history is messy too, missionary work in the LDS church skyrockets. Baptisms were suddenly a lot easier to come by. The church no longer found itself at odds with the federal government. Over time, they're able to pay off their federal debt. We see the tithing program instituted, and all of these things coming out of their reaction to polygamy. And the LDS group took our DNC 132, which was once, the doctrine of celestial marriage to mean plural marriage. They've transitioned over the century celestial marriage to mean monogamous marriage. So we've moved away from a more fluid definition of the family to a more mainstream one, and we see this in the church's focus on the mainstream family now since we've moved away from polygamy. And moving away from this has actually allowed the church to lift its ban on the African American temple ban and priesthood ban. And just as a side note, just so you know, other fundamentalist groups used to teach their kids a rote prayer. They would stand and face the LDS temple and pray that someday the doors would be open to them and the church would be set in order. And when the LDS church lifted the temple and priesthood ban, most of these other groups felt like the church was in full apostasy, the temples have been corrupt. This is where you see the AUB building their own temples, and most of the rote prayers stopped being said. I think Brian Hill says that convert baptisms to the AUB that year tripled from the LDS church. So a lot of people left the LDS church to join the AUB. This reaction To Polygamy helped define a new generation of LDS Mormons that believed that they had nothing to do with polygamy, and that the LDS Church has been working hard ever since to distance itself from the practice. But really quick, before I end, I just want to, for fun, show you just how connected the mainstream church is to fundamentalists. So in Teachings and Beliefs, both believe in traditional restoration story of Joseph Smith and the Grove. They subscribe to the Book of Mormon, the Plan of Salvations, with some obvious tweaks to the top tier of the Celestial Kingdom, and the temple endowment and sealing practices. They all believe in the restored order of the priesthood, some form of preordination, predestination, priesthood keys, sealing and saving ordinances, and Joseph Smith, Brigham Young translation of the Bible. In location, headquarters are all in Utah, of all the groups, LDS Church, Kingston, AUB, FLDS. Many of these groups own businesses that members often frequent. So the Order of the Kingston Group sponsor the Utah Jazz, and they sponsor a lot of Mormon-owned Larry H. Miller companies and restaurants. And the AUB owns health and natural food stores that LDS people go to, and the LDS own Desert Book and the distribution center, which a lot of fundamentalists go to get their supplies and their novelties. So it's easy to think that we have distanced ourselves, but if you think about it, there's still a generation that is still alive today that grew up before the 1930s, distancing itself, the Mormon Church distancing itself from fundamentalism. I'll just give you some prominent leaders that have some prominent fundamentalist connections. Spencer W. Kimball, for example, he married into the Eyring family Polygamist through marriage, and his middle name, W, stands for Woolley. Now, John Woolley was the founding father of Mormon fundamentalism. He was like the guy that started the movement. He's also Spencer W. Kimball's uncle. That's what the W in his name stands for, is Woolley. Let's see. Ezra Taft Benson, another Mormon president, was born to a polygamist father. He had polygamist great-grandparents. His grandfather, Ezra T. Benson, married one of Joseph Smith's wives, Desdemona Fuller. Benson actually was sealed to his cousin, who had died in 1950. When she died, he had his wife Flora stand in as a proxy. So they performed a polygamous sealing with his wife standing in as a proxy in 1950. Gordon B. Hinckley went to the same high school as Rulon Jeffs, who was Warren Jeffs' father. Rulon served a mission with Cleon Skousen in England, and Rulon actually married Hugh B. Brown's daughter, Zola, for a time. And we have current apostles like Dallin H. Oaks, who's another example, who has been sealed to multiple women and is proud of the fact. So ignoring all the multiple sealings that leaders continue to currently practice in a posthumous sense, there are many, many more connections like this, reminding us that we can try to get away from this doctrine in perception, but we can't even do it in name. So in conclusion, it would seem that while each group has a right to shore up their own boundaries for group identity, we would all be very mistaken to believe we can extricate ourselves from our very tied past, a past that is indeed very much Mormon. Thank you.
Good afternoon. So I'm going to give an address that's an abridgment of a greater paper that I've written. It's Progressive Polygamy and Alternative. I remember sitting in this classroom where the cinder block walls had been painted over one too many times, a pale yellow that looked like rubber. I couldn't have been more than 10 years old. I'm old enough that the Sunday school teacher was still scratching on a green chalkboard the answers to her question. The list was of the world's greatest sins. She had asked the class to call out everything they could think of: murder, adultery, and then polygamy. Weird that a cute little girl with long brown hair would be the first person to introduce a concept that would forever change my life. In the West, meaning Europe and the United States, many share this little girl's belief that polygamy is a sin. But much of the world still holds that polygamy is a virtuous and deific mandate. I was among them. 30 years later, I found myself a leader of the Mormon fundamentalist polygamist group, Apostolic United Brethren, or AUB. I drank the Kool-Aid pretty deep. It was blue and it was delicious. I'm talking snarky, but true. I really thought that because I was a member of the AUB and held the priesthood and had received many of the ordinances and had 5 united wives and worked in their temple and was a 70 apostle and was the bishop and was white, and was a man, and was heterosexual, that I was somehow better than all those who couldn't say those same things. I believed that God looked down on me as one of his chosen ones, I was in a position of privilege and power over my wives. I was a patriarch. I have since left the AUB, having embraced a progressive worldview in place of the fundamentalist one of my childhood and early adulthood. With this progressiveness came the realization of the hypocrisy of my marriage. I had married 5 women while a member of the AUB. We, the 6 of us, all innocently lived by the rules of patriarchy. I was the head of the family and ruled with my wives by my side. I was taught that these 5 women were to be as jewels in my crown, and that if I proved worthy, would one day be their lord and king. I cringe at how unabashedly I believed this drivel. After years of critical thinking and the reading of many feminist works, my wives and I became convinced the life of a traditional polygamist and the ideal of patriarchy was something we did not want for our family. I believe if traditional fundamentalist polygamists would consider a progressive feminist critique of their worldview, many would embrace an alternative lifestyle. Sadly, many shrink from this evolution out of the fear of losing their families. We certainly experienced this fear. It need not be a zero-sum outcome. One can relinquish the idea of male superiority and rule without abandoning one's polygamous marriage. This paper is an effort to provide a viable polygamous alternative that abandons traditional patriarchal polygamy while embracing a new progressive ideal. Traditional polygamy a problem. Polygamy is generally considered a depraved lifestyle, and justifiably so. For thousands of years, women within polygamy have suffered at the hands of men. More than just the subjugation of women, polygamous sects have been guilty of all brands of bigotry. Race, gender, and socio-political are just a few. There is a dark history of abuse being perpetrated within polygamous sects, and many continue to this day. But, as I will show, it would be a mistake to think that these evils only exist in polygamy. Indeed, they find their advent in monogamy. The problem isn't polygamy, it's patriarchy. Perhaps when referring to traditional polygamy, I should instead say traditional patriarchal polygamy. All of the moral problems with polygamy can be blamed on patriarchy and not the multiplicity of one's spouses. I suggest that the issue is not more than one spouse, but the subservience and virtual ownership of one spouse by another. This is not peculiar to polygamy. In fact, it all started with monogamy, as I said. It's called patriarchy. My next reference, it may be a little bit outdated, but it goes to prove my point of patriarchy being the problem. In The Origin of the Family, Private Property in the State, Frederick Ingalls, through an examination of the teleological history of the family, shows how women went from a position of power to the role of the subjugated sex within the family institution, giving a clear description of the advent of monogamy and with it the evils of patriarchy. This need not be how things remain. The status and condition of women can and must change. Women in all marriage types, whether monogamous or polygamous, are subjected to the problems of patriarchy. Solve patriarchy, take away the ability for a man to dominate a woman, and one solves many of the moral problems in marriage, both monogamous and polygamous. If the moral improprieties were eliminated, it would seem that any consenting, informed adult should have the right to marry. This is apropos as the announcement yesterday in the courts, recriminalizing polygamy. Polygamy, feminism's strangest bedfellow. At first glance, any positive association of feminism and polygamy would seem oxymoronic. Across the altar of marriage, traditional polygamy has always embraced the patriarchy. Women, since the advent of marriage, have been subjugated, treated as little more than breed stock. A polygamous man once chastised my progressive leanings by paraphrasing some obscure passage, I believe is in 1 Timothy. Women are saved by the fact that they bear children. They aren't meant to learn anything other than the proper raising up of their children to the Lord. This is only one example of many infractions against women in historically typical polygamous situations. So why would I suggest that feminism could be a friend of polygamy, that age-old champion of this sexist evil? What if there was a polygamy that empowered women, that gave women equal access to family government, that enabled women to have children and pursue a dynamic role outside of just the maternal? What if there was a polygamous system of marriage that in some ways did just as good a job of empowering women, than even monogamy. Such a polygamy would not only comply with feminist demands, but would actually lend itself to the realization of the feminist ideal. Progressive polygamy is this system. As I mentioned, after several years of introspection and rigorous study, my wives and I realized the error of our fundamentalist worldview. Progressive polygamy is the brainchild of our desperation to have our cake and eat it too. We were unwilling to sacrifice either our family or our new beliefs. So the six of us set ourselves to the task of creating a marriage unit which could reconcile these seemingly opposing worlds. By addressing both the moral problems of patriarchy and the structural problems of the poly lifestyle, a new egalitarian marriage system is possible. There are 4 parts to making progressive polygamy viable. The first is the abandonment of the gender binary. In progressive polygamy, there can be one man with 3 women, or one woman with 3 men. Even 3 husbands or just 5 wives are okay. 3 husbands and 2 wives could work. The numbers and gender of the marriage makeup doesn't matter. Second is the empowering of women outside of just the maternal. In progressive polygamy, all spouses share the responsibility of providing for the day-to-day needs of the family equally. Sharing responsibility does not mean all adults must get a job. Rather, that there is an agreement about who is best fit to work and when, towards meeting the demands of the family, be it professional or domestic. This would necessarily include female members. A woman within progressive polygamy who once felt it an impossibility to go to university or to pursue a career now finds herself with more adult members in the family who can provide love, devotion, and care for her children. Where once a mother would feel trapped as the only nurturing feminine figure in the home, now there are more mothers and fathers to share in the maternal duties. This is an obvious enabler in the feminist ideal of honoring the maternal as well as inserting oneself into the world outside of the home. Third is the abandonment of patriarchy and the embracing of a progressive worldview. I've written about patriarchy and its penchant for the subjugation of women. It pervades all of society. It depends on a worldview that looks at men as natural leaders, uniquely made by God to handle all of society's affairs. It's no wonder that polygamous men are so full of themselves. They literally believe they have a mandate from heaven to rule over their wives. It takes a special kind of special to believe that God in heaven privileges a man just because he has dangly bits hanging between his legs. Obviously, I'm talking crass for effect. But hopefully it stirs polygamous men to navel gaze and see if they really believe that just because they were made sexually a man, they are necessarily endowed with more clarity of thought or wisdom of choice than their less anatomically godly wife. Sadly, in the world today, even so-called advanced first world countries like the U.S., people still believe in this sexist, bigoted drivel. It seems that in order for someone to occupy this mental space, they are answering the call to be a bigot. Abandon this immoral mandate of fundamentalism and stifled thought, and the clarity of progress will have room to manifest. I say again, the problem with polygamy is not the number of spouses one has, it is largely how one treats them. The progressive polygamist must not suffer from these delusions. Treat a spouse with moral care, and the progressive polygamist is halfway to a justification of the poly lifestyle. But even after the moral problem of patriarchy is extinguished, a structural one remains. There has always been a central spouse, and with it, inequity of time and commitment. The fourth part to establishing progressive polygamy is perhaps the most tedious and certainly the most underanalyzed. The replacing of the hub and spoke structure of traditional polygamy with the egalitarian marriage unit, or EMU model. In place of the hub and spoke model of traditional polygamy, EMU has just the will. All spouses are equally married to all other spouses, each enjoying the love, devotion, and commitment of all other spouses, be it money, resources, or time. In this marriage, every spouse is married to every other spouse. It is incumbent upon every spouse to view the entirety of the marriage as central. The importance of love and devotion being focused on the marriage as a whole rather than just one central spouse. Also, every spouse has equal access and voice when determining family policy. Using democratic techniques, each person has an equal say regardless of sex or gender, thus creating a politically egalitarian union. It would be up to all participants to determine the nature of the family government, much like there is a multitude of ways for a monogamous couple to run their family. As for sex, that is more problematic. I can hear the naysayers crying, but what about sex? Does everybody just have sex with everybody? Well, yes and no. In my own case, I have gone to my wives, and together we did away with the original marriage contract. If I can have more than one sexual partner, then, if they chose, they could too. This could be trouble, as my jealous emotions might get in the way, and knowing me, they probably would. But in order for this to be a truly egalitarian unit, this right, whether it is ever exercised or not, must exist. I admit, it seems rather convenient for me, the former hub, to grant my wives the right to have sex with other partners while the looming emotional threat of jealousy hangs over their heads. Perhaps the answer lies somewhere between the balance of having a right and the informed consenting adult not exercising that right for the sake of a greater happiness. This is a problem I don't have room for, but it will need to be addressed. Real life is much messier, right, than theory. So to sum up progressive polygamy, first and perhaps foremost, one must not be a patriarchal jerk. We live in a world where there is no excuse to remain bigoted. Women should have equal access to every right and privilege that men have. Obviously, this includes marriage, and particularly the more historically bigoted variety of traditional polygamy. Second, the structural deficiencies found in traditional polygamy and the hub-and-spoke model must be replaced by the EMU. This will ensure equal access to family government and the right to sex. If this arrangement is not conducive to any participant's current worldviews, they should feel unfettered to break the marriage contract and seek companionship elsewhere. While theorizing about the idea of progressive polygamy is all well and good, I admit that the implementation in real life is much more messy, as I said earlier. Conclusion. I have identified traditional polygamy and its pernicious exploitation of women. Truly, it deserves much of the criticism that has been laid at its feet. But as bad as it is, the real blame for the ills of polygamy belong with patriarchy, a view that many feminists would agree with. In fact, I have shown that the problem with polygamy is not the multitude of spouses, rather the exploitation and subjugation of women by men, a condition that found its advent with monogamy. Indeed, when the evils of patriarchy are removed, the moral problems of polygamy are solved. But structural inequality remained. I tackled this problem and suggested a new progressive polygamy. I end with an appeal to polygamists. And I wrote this a time ago and then adapted it yesterday for the events of yesterday. Time to grow up, the polygamist dilemma. On April 11, 2016, the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals struck down the 2013 decision of United States District Court Judge Clark Wattups, which found Utah's anti-polygamy law unconstitutional. Indeed, it is a momentous and unwelcome ruling for all polygamists. But where does this leave the polygamist community? I find myself wondering, what responsibility do I have as a practicing polygamist in light of this ruling? Do I just hunker down into my well-populated home and live in sequestered fear with my 5 wives, ever worrying that I might be incarcerated and my children fostered out? I can't do it. It must be said, polygamists, fundamentalist polygamists in particular, need to change their ways. We need to show society and the courts that we are deserving of the freedom to live our lifestyle. For thousands of years, women and children have been subjected to the rampant misogyny found in the practice of traditional patriarchal polygamy. Women are relegated to a subservient role, made out to be jewels in the crown of their priesthood-bearing husband and future lord. The argument is made by many polygamist women that as they hold this same priesthood through their husband, a common one in the mainstream LDS as well, accompanied with the ability to bear children, they are made equal with their husband. This thinking needs to end. Women don't need to be made equal. They always already are. Women are equal in every meaningful way. They are not a subclass to be utilized by men, exploited for their childbearing abilities. Rather, they should occupy a place as equals with no qualifiers included. The days of the commodification of women must end. No more marrying off widows or divorcees to the next qualified man. In the best of circumstances, this is done with the consent of the women. Sadly, much worse is commonplace. In some communities, these women are forced into arranged marriages, told they are told who they are with next, and given a mandate to bear his children. Many times, this practice is in the sole effort to fulfill a quota a man must meet in order for him to inherit the highest degree of the celestial kingdom, and thus become a god himself. All polygamous men and women everywhere need to say, no more. No more will I participate in the traditions of my fathers. I will stand for equality. I will stand for the rights of all, no matter their gender, sex, or station. Insist that priesthood will no longer be used to exercise control over another. Demand that fear be removed from our chapels and homes. Find symmetry in your marriages. Let compassion be the grand motivator. Deal with each other as equals. Never enact or endure the subjugation of another. End the socially constructed roles of thousands of years. We polygamists are fighting for the right to live unmolested by the government. Let's prove that we are deserving of that assessment by abandoning those darker practices of traditional polygamy that have haunted us for so long. There are many aspects of the fundamentalist culture which need to be transformed. My intent is that all polygamists everywhere use this newest court ruling. Let it energize you to new levels of awakening. Find the courage to transform yourselves into agents of change. Become noble ambassadors of justice and peace in this world by holding to ways of love and equality. Embrace a new progressive polygamy. Thank you.
When we talk about the idea of who is a polygamist or who is not, what kind of polygamist you are, what kind of theology you have that guides you, it always comes down really to a discussion of definitions. I look to Ferdinand de Saussure to talk about this idea and really pointing out something that he's very well known for, that in language there are only differences. In other words, we are defined not by what we are, but what we are not. And even if you look at mainstream Mormonism, a lot of the times Mormons are known by the things they don't do, not necessarily the things that they do. However, we always want this need to define. We want to be able to label ourselves, to make sense of the world around us. Claude Levi-Strauss talked about this as the science of the concrete, the basic human need to order the universe around us. When something is unknown, when it doesn't have a name, it causes a certain amount of anxiety, that we like to be able to make sense of the world around us, to understand it in a way that makes sense to us. Classifying, as opposed to not classifying, has a value of its own, whatever form that classification may take, founded on this demand for order. And if you think about it, it's something that is commonly done at maybe the most base of levels. If you think about it, and this is something that I talk about with my students on a regular basis, what happens when you try a new food? Seriously, I'm asking you. Okay, what do we hear as a comparison? It's better. It's better. Oh, booyah! It tastes like chicken. Okay, why do we say alligator, rabbit, tastes like chicken? Hey, we all eat chicken, right? Chicken is the familiar. And so when we have an experience that is unfamiliar, we look around for a way to drag it to the familiar, to put it in a way where we can actually make sense of it. And so what happens when we take this idea and this theory and place it onto the discussion of polygamy is it really asks us to ask the question, what is the familiar social narrative regarding polygamous communities? When people talk about polygamous communities or they talk about polygamy, what do you think of? What comes to mind? Families? What was that? Prairie dresses, the pioneer outfits, the big hairstyles, abuse. Hey, I'm sorry? FLDS. Okay, that is one of the largest sort of triggers when we're talking about this understanding of polygamy. Some of these political cartoons that I've pulled really kind of talk about this need to connect it to what we think we already know. When someone says polygamy, we we think we already know what that means. It's Warren Jeffs and child brides. It's talking about needing to drag polygamy into something that is seen as primitive or is seen as unsophisticated. It's talking about polygamy in a way that makes light of current situations that are traumatic for those that are involved. All of these political cartoons are really making that same point, that we can take from these ideas a few basic ideas of what we think the prevailing social narrative is. So Mormon polygamy's current social narrative teaches us that polygamy is the product of a cult. Polygamy is inherently abusive toward women and children. Polygamy forbids interaction, education, and interaction with the outside world. Polygamous marriages require underage girls to marry significantly older men, and that polygamy is illegal. Okay, these are things that we carry with us because of that larger media narrative that we've all been exposed to for decades. The idea of a cult is one that I'd like to touch on because it's something that's brought up pretty regularly. So what is the definition of a cult? Well, it's the church down the street from yours. Okay, just let that sink for a minute. I really like this cartoon because I think it makes a very important point, but I also want to say that this in no way should be seen as a whitewashing of actual abuses that do occur in some polygamous communities. There are some communities that are very much seen as being cult-like, but it's interesting that when we're talking about the idea of a cult, particularly as it's connected to polygamous lifestyle, we're really not understanding what's happening within some of those communities. We're simply saying we understand the familiar social narrative of polygamy, and so any discussion of polygamy is automatically dragged to that place because it allows us to make sense of it. But in reality, not all polygamy is the FLDS. And not everything in the FLDS is abusive. An important thing that I'd like to mention, particularly with the fieldwork that I've been doing fieldwork for about the last 5 years or so in Centennial Park. Centennial Park is located just 3 miles from Colorado City, and although it is very close geographically, it is worlds away in terms of actual practice. And so some of those narrative aspects that we talked about with the prevailing social narrative of polygamy are openly challenged by Centennial Park. The first is that Centennial Park is open. It is not a closed cult. It welcomes visitors to nearly every religious and community event. From the very first moment, I met people from Centennial Park and was interested in engaging in some kind of research and study. I've been invited to Sunday services, to tour the Masada Charter School, to the Merry Wives Cafe, to the annual fair, and to individual homes for dinner. Okay, what you see here are some women from the Centennial Park community. Okay, they look like regular modern women having a fun time at a fair. The idea of closed off and under control is something that doesn't really apply when you're taking a look at how polygamy is practiced within the community of Centennial Park. More importantly, Centennial Park women don't feel abused. I remember way back when I was first entering this area of research, and someone said to me in kind of an off comment, and I think he meant it quite seriously, he said, the thing about polygamists, the thing about sister wives, is they don't even know they're being abused. It's our job to tell them they are. Okay, the amount of privilege that is encompassed into that statement is wholly problematic. Okay, people get to define their own experiences. And what someone chooses to define as their marriage or their family is ultimately their decision. And the women of Centennial Park feel that a polygamous lifestyle has brought them many benefits. Polygamy is an empowering lifestyle for women. It provides me the environment and opportunity to maximize my female potential without all the trade-offs and compromises that attend monogamy. The women in my family are friends. You don't share 2 decades of experience and a man without those friendships becoming very special. And perhaps one of my favorite quotations from someone who lives in Centennial Park and has come to become a good friend as well is that monogamy makes slaves of women. Polygamy is freeing. Monogamy is not. Many of these women who I've got to know in Centennial Park, again, defying the stereotype that they're closed up and locked in, they're on social media, they're Facebook friends, and they follow me. I am, pretty standard in terms of the American family. I have a husband, I have 2 children, and with all the activities that are going on, they're in middle school, there's a million things happening in any one day. Regularly, my friends from Centennial Park will message me and say, Jennifer, you need a sister wife. And honestly, I'd be lying if I didn't get that appeal on some level, because it does allow more freedom for women when women actively choose to participate, not when they are forced to. Centennial Park also defies the stereotype that fundamentalists or those involved with polygamy simply aren't concerned with educating their children. Okay, Masada Charter School, which is built by the community right in the center of Centennial Park, is an award-winning school. And I don't mean it's an award-winning school as in I printed out a certificate and I framed it and I'm telling you. I'm saying that it is an award-winning school based on the very competitive selection of blue ribbon schools by the United States government. It is a school that serves K through 8. The mission is to really create very well-rounded global citizens. It's very important to point out that although Masada is right there in Centennial Park, it is not a religious school. Okay, it is not a religious school. Do virtually all of the students who attend participate in families that are practicing a plural lifestyle? Yes. But there is not a religious curriculum. It is about really making sure that kids have access to technology, to education, to theories that we would want any young child to be exposed to. And Centennial Park makes sure that that happens. As I've also alluded to, in Centennial Park, women choose to get married. Marriage under the age of 18 is not permitted. Women also typically choose their spouse, not the men. The Council of Brethren may be consulted for guidance. If a woman feels that she wants to get married and hasn't received some kind of guidance to whom she should be married, she may approach the Council of Brethren and say that I'm ready to be married. You have any suggestions? And they will meet, they'll talk about it, they may present an idea to her, but ultimately she is the one who decides. It is not something that is orchestrated or arranged. There are willing participants on both sides. No one is forced to marry anyone they don't want to marry. No one. Now, I don't know what's happening over there in reference to Colorado City. That's what we hear in the media, but we don't know whether to trust it. I mentioned before that the common perception is that polygamy is illegal, and then the common perception that polygamy was not. Well, we're now back to polygamy being illegal as of yesterday. And to be fair, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about the Waddups ruling. It didn't make polygamy legal. What it did was decriminalize it from a third-degree felony. And so even though for a short while, up until yesterday, you could participate in a polygamous marriage, at no point were you getting separate marriage licenses. At no point were you recognized by the government. Okay? All the ruling did was take the cohabitation aspect out, where before, it's merely claiming to be married to someone, even though it wasn't done through legal government channels, it was a celestial marriage of more importance to those practicing polygamy. Even then, you could be arrested for simply living with someone who you said was your wife who isn't your legal wife. So it's quite absurd on its face. The cohabitation clause was struck down in 2014, filed appeal in 2015. New legislation has recently been introduced to recriminalize polygamy, but yesterday, as I'm sure you've known, that ruling was overturned. And it wasn't that the ruling was made to recriminalize polygamy. As I understand it, and it's still fairly new, so I may not be 100% correct here, but as I understand it, the original lawsuit by the Browns was thrown out on a technicality, and recriminalizing polygamy is just the side effect of throwing that suit out. The Centennial Park Action Committee has made it their point to decriminalize polygamy. They are out there in the community talking about it. And they also make sure that rather than only saying, here is what we are not, they also tell you what they are. That their principles and doctrines comes from Joseph Smith. They are not, nor have ever been, part of the LDS Church. We maintain that we have the right of choice in our religion, in our marriages, and all other matters that pertain to us. We are not ashamed of our religion, our heritage, or our family systems. We wish to define ourselves. We refuse to maintain the stereotypes unfairly placed upon us by hate groups, and that we are not victims of our religion. Any of you that are more interested in knowing about the Centennial Park Action Committee, which is really a group of people committed to making the outside world aware of what they believe in and what they practice, that website that was up there, the cpaction.org, gives you a lot of information about what they do value, what is important to them, and why they think that their lifestyle really deserves the respect and, more importantly, protection under the law. Very often, it's religious minority practices that are especially flagged as being harmful. Religious majorities don't tend to come under the same scrutiny. One of the things that I've been hearing lately, particularly because I tend to be a bit of a social justice warrior, and I'm always feeling like I need to stand up for the underdog. I'm always feeling that I need to clarify misunderstandings that people have about particular groups, is that when I mention that women in Centennial Park are choosing polygamy, I oftentimes get responses like, well, can it really be a choice? Because their religion teaches them that they need that for celestial glory. But my question is, how is that any different than the mainstream Mormon church? The mainstream Mormon church doesn't frown on young marriages. My niece, who's 19, just got married. We know from part of Lindsay's presentation, as I'm sure that you knew as well, that there are many Mormon men who are sealed currently to more than one woman. The same kinds of issues that we pick at and that we condemn in minority groups often happen in the majority group. But we don't have that same critical eye, and that kind of privilege, sort of finger pointing, really needs to end. As Polly Dockstader, who is the principal of Masada Charter School, said in 2011 interview, unlock the door so you can see for yourself that plural marriage can stand up to scrutiny in the light of day. Centennial Park makes themselves available to the outside world. They invite conversation. They want you to understand what's happening there, because what's happening there is not what you think of polygamy. Thank you.